Okay.
You still working on your slides, Jan?
Yes, I am. Got to get those going.
Hey, I see Sarah Epperson. I saw Laura Cooper.
Hey.
All right, here we go. Welcome tonight and good evening to all of you who are here for our first night of Conquering Dyslexia, a book study. We're really happy you are here tonight. My name is Julie Bedell, and we also have Amy Fleischer and Dr. Jan Hasbrouck. All of us are founding board members of Read Washington. And we're really happy you're here. So Jan, there we go. Okay, but it's not just us that is doing this book study. We want to thank everybody that's part of it. Really, it's a lot of volunteer time of a lot of people. Decoding Dyslexia from Pennsylvania, the Reading League from Pennsylvania, the International Dyslexia Association, Pennsylvania branch. And then we're going to hop over to Wisconsin for the Reading League Wisconsin and Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin. And you will find out real soon that each section of the book study is going to be facilitated by different states. So this week is Washington with some follow-up, which you'll see here, how it works. And then when we get to chapter 3, there'll be some, that will be Pennsylvania, and then chapters 4 and 5 will be Wisconsin. So the way this works is Jan will always kick us off with an hour presentation. And then the following week on a Tuesday, we'll have a parent discussion for those who want to join. And we'll have an educator discussion on a Thursday. If you're a parent and you can't make it to the parent, but can make it to the educator, I think that's fine as well. All of these different events have different links. So remember that Google Doc that got you here, you're going to need that to get to the other presentations and small group chats. By the way, everything starts at 5 Pacific Standard Time, so that would be 8 East Coast time. So just some extra important information. Please use the Google Doc to find the Zoom link, as I said, for each night. Fill out the Google form. That lets us know you're here. Like Jan says, it's in lieu of actually registering. If you want continuing hours, you will find that on that Google form. Just to let you know that we are recording, and most likely you'll be able to find Jan's 3, and maybe there might be one other one. You'll find Jan's presentations at the Read Washington and the, I think it is the Reading League Wisconsin YouTube links. As far as some logistics, use the Q&A for any questions you have for Jan. About midway, we're going to pause, and Amy will probably ask Jan some questions that actually you have asked. We're going to really try hard to keep to an hour to honor everyone's time. And with that, Jan, I think we're ready to get to your presentation.
All right, very good. Thank you, Julie and Amy and everybody volunteering to pull this off tonight, and welcome all of you who are attending. I know some of you I know so well, and you know much about me. For some of you, you may have stumbled upon my book and not know very much about me. So I want to give you a little bit of my background. I do live in beautiful, not so beautiful today, it's one of those yucky rainy days, but beautiful Seattle, Washington. So we're on the Pacific Coast. As Julie and Amy, my co-host tonight, we all live in Seattle. My professional career started off a long time ago. I was a reading specialist and a reading coach, and that was in Oregon, where I grew up, and I did that for 15 years. Then I ended up pursuing a doctorate at the University of Oregon, and I stayed on there for a while as a researcher and an instructor. And then I had a wonderful opportunity to work as a professor at Texas A&M University. And then a lot of reasons I came back to the West Coast and have lived in Oregon, Washington, California, and work more independently these days, still affiliated with the University of Oregon, connected with lots of researchers and folks doing anything related to reading and education. As Julie mentioned, I'm very happy to have been a co-founder and current board member of Read Washington. You should check out our website. We're doing many exciting things along with the other groups who are working to present this information to you tonight. I do think it's important for you to know, if you don't already, that part of the work I'm currently doing is working with various publishers, and I want to be very clear about that. Tonight, the work I'm doing here has no affiliation with any publisher, including the publisher of my dyslexia book. I'm doing this completely independently, as are all the groups that are participating tonight. But I do have these professional affiliations. I'm a member of the author team for the McGraw-Hill Education Wonders program and their Wonder Works. I've written other books and assessment tools that are available commercially. My name has been for many years, couple of decades now, affiliated with Read Naturally, and some people assume that I'm an author of the Read Naturally program. I'm not. I simply got connected with the woman who is the author of that and have been doing trainings for Read Naturally for a number of years. I currently, part-time and virtually, work as a volunteer reading coach at a nearby K-8 school here in Seattle. It just happens to be the school where my grandson is in 3rd grade. And if you haven't started reading the book yet, I will also let you know that I have a daughter with dyslexia. So the book is the focus of our work over these 3 sessions. It's organized around 5 chapters that we will go through in 3 sections. This was written, and the subtitle is A Guide for Early Detection and Intervention for Teachers and Families. So I want to tell you a little bit more tonight about how this book came to be, and also just let you know that instead of really doing an analysis of the content or just presenting the content to you, I decided, I mean, hopefully if I've done my job as an author, the content is pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. But I'm happy to have the opportunity to do a little deeper dive and explore some of the issues or questions you may have. And that can come up also in the follow-up sessions that we have for parents and educators. But I thought I would give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, if you will, about some aspects of the book that don't appear actually between the covers. So how did this book even come to be? I was approached by some folks at Benchmark Education, the publisher of this book, the division called PD Essentials. Some folks that I knew there over many years. And they approached me and simply asked if I would like to write a book about dyslexia. They, some of them knew, not all of them knew, that I had a daughter with dyslexia. They also knew, though, that my entire professional career has been working with children, adolescents, adults who struggle with learning to read because of a disability or other challenges. So that has been my life's work. And when they asked me to write this book, I said yes. I was very eager to do something straightforward, clear, current, accurate for both teachers who are just getting started exploring dyslexia. This wasn't a book written for experts. There are many wonderful books out there that are written more at the expert level. This is more of a introduction. And I also wanted something for parents. As a parent of a now grown child with dyslexia, I kept every day when I was writing this book, I kept thinking about I wished I'd had this information presented to me. So that's really how we did this. And when I agreed to do the book, I said, I think there are 3 chapters. What is dyslexia, how to assess it, and how to teach it. So that I had 3 chapters in mind, but they ultimately broke it into 5 chapters for the book to make it a little bit equal. There are 12, slightly more than 12 pages of references. These are the professional sources that I used to validate and verify what I wanted to say. This is not my opinion in this book. I wanted to be sure that I was representing the most current and the most accurate research. So I did a lot more reading than I actually did writing. And so I feel very confident that the content of this information is accurate and up to date. But having said that, dyslexia, although we know vastly more than we did even just a few years ago about dyslexia, there are certain aspects that we are still figuring out through research and exploration. So I felt along the way that even people who are truly experts in the field would have some disagreements with each other. So I felt I needed to pick one kind of touchstone reference. And just so you know, I picked the work of Jack Fletcher and colleagues in his 2nd edition of the book Learning Disabilities, From Identification to Intervention, and spent a lot of time in that book. And you'll see Fletcher et al. Referenced a lot during the book. And as we started organizing the book, as I started turning in the chapters, the editor and publisher who worked with me really wanted to be sure we took a very positive tone. And I was looking the page number of this. I put page numbers throughout the book, but this support circle is on page 7 of the book. And this was a graphic that the artist there came up with. Really sets the tone for the book, that this is very positive. We know a lot about dyslexia. We know a lot about what to do about dyslexia, but it's not something that families can do on their own. It's not something that teachers or tutors or speech pathologists or researchers or school psychologists or tutors can do on their own. We have to work together. And when we do, and we follow the most current, accurate research, wonderful, wonderful things can happen for our students with dyslexia. As we were creating this graphic, we played around with what should go in the middle of the graphic. We wanted a photograph of some child. We went back and forth, but ended up with this cutie. Of course, I'm highly prejudiced because this is a picture of my daughter, Lizzie. I think she was 5 years old. We were long away, many years from figuring out that she had dyslexia, but she was giving reading a good try as a kindergartner. This is a picture of Lizzie today. Lizzie, who also lives in Seattle. I'm very lucky to have both of my kids living here. All grown up, graduate of high school, college, advanced degrees, one of those dyslexia who's triumphed, conquered dyslexia, if you will. She still has dyslexia and it shows up in many ways, but she's one of the many, many success stories of adults. So I'm happy to share her story along the way. But along with the story of Lizzie and her journey in dyslexia, I love the fact that so many people generously allowed us to share their stories as well. So we have stories from parents, from teachers, from tutors. That picture at the bottom, that beautiful picture is Julie, who is one of our co-hosts tonight, who is a tutor in her story. She shared her story in the book too, and many, many others. So let's go ahead and get started now that you know a little bit of the background. So within chapter 1, starting on page 11, we start talking about what dyslexia is by using the definition from the International Dyslexia Association. This is a perfect example of the fact that there are experts who would disagree with each other. There is not one universally accepted definition of dyslexia. There is a central understanding these days of what dyslexia is, but a lot of people have slightly different nuanced definitions. So I just went ahead and used the, I think, accurate, up-to-date, fairly complex definition from the International Dyslexia Association, which refers to dyslexia as a specific learning disability, neurobiological, difficulties with accurate and or fluent recognition, often poor spelling and decoding, typically resulting from a deficit in the phonological component of language, and unexpected. That's one of the terms most people use. And we're going to spend more time with this definition and some of these terms when we get into chapter 3. So we'll come back to that. But when we talk to parents and many teachers and others these days about dyslexia, we often hear terms like this, that, oh yeah, dyslexia, those kids have trouble with reversing letters, B's and D's, P's and Q's, that the text moves around on the page for them, or they're mirror writing or reading backwards, or yes, they have eye problems or vision problems, and more boys than girls have dyslexia. Or there still are those people who say, oh, dyslexia, no, it's not really real. These kids just need, they're smart kids, they just need to try harder. And what we know, it's very comforting, I think, for many of us, that these are myths of dyslexia. And we spend a couple of pages talking about some of the major myths, 10 of the major myths of dyslexia. And we know they're myths because of the research that has been done over the last 100 years or more. But the research over the last few years has really just jumped our knowledge and understanding of dyslexia. And this research has been done in two different groups, as we talk about in the book a bit. Some of that comes from the medical field, where they're actually studying the function of the physical brain through neuroanatomy, even ophthalmology. Are the eyes involved in dyslexia, developmental, cognitive, neuroscience, all of that brain development and structure. And then those of us over in the psychology and education, the function of the brain, not its physical function, but its practical structure, function in its utility, and how brains become a reading brain from many areas in psychology and education, and very importantly, audiology and speech pathology, because of the major contributions or understandings of the deficits that contribute to dyslexia. We need all of these people working together. And so we've been collecting and conducting this research for quite a long time, but as I said, it's the research over the last few years that has just thrust our understanding of dyslexia far forward. And it was started about 20 years ago when a brand new tool became available that allowed images to be taken of brains in a non-invasive way. The pictures at the top, that little girl was one of the first children involved in some of the early studies. And those pictures are very important because of her lovely smile there and you can kind of see some hair peeking out around the edges there. This new way of scanning brains meant that we didn't have to shave the children's heads and implant electrodes into their scalp. It was not painful, non-invasive. And for the first time, we could get pictures of what was actually happening, the function of the brain, the processes that were going on as children engaged in reading. So what she's doing with the lab tech there at the top is reading. She's engaging in reading while this huge machine is magnetically imaging the blood flow. It's magnets are tracing essentially the red blood cells, the iron in the red blood cells, which flow to different parts of the brain depending on how they are being used. So that magnetic encephalography, or fMRIs, magnetic resonance imaging. Then the pictures at the bottom is how 20 some years later, even the machines themselves have expanded and become more modern. And those are pictures from the imaging labs of Dr. Nadine Gabb, who is another major person, major source of my understanding and information. She's cited frequently in the book, as you will see. And tonight I'm going to quote her as well. So these are the kinds of images that result from those magnetic encephalography and fMRIs with even very young children, where we can see differences in the brain even before they begin to read. So the child at the left is demonstrating blood flow, those red dots symbolizing where the activity is when engaging in a pre-literacy task, because these children are not reading, but doing something related to the alphabet or linguistic activities. This child at the left, we can label not at risk because their brain is responding to these linguistic tasks by processing the information in the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is our brain, which has evolved to function for us as humans. It processes language. That's where language should be processed. And we have come to understand through a lot of research, a lot of process, that reading, writing, and spelling are essentially language-based tasks and also should be happening in the left hemisphere. So we know that the child on the right, we can label that child at risk because doing the identical task, this child's brain is processing this linguistic information in their right hemisphere, the one that is not naturally attuned to doing those kinds of tasks. It's helped us understand so much more. Some of the studies that have been done, I didn't really do a big explanation of a lot of this research in the book, trying to keep it as simple as possible and focused on parents. But this study is a good explanation of how this research in dyslexia has been done over the last 20 years. So this is one of the most early studies. And I have the full title there, the lead author, Simos, in the Neurology. If you want to read the study, it is available online. You can search for it. And this study, very typical of these studies that use the fMRI machines, tend to be very small because access to those machines is incredibly expensive. There aren't that many of them. Everybody wants a little bit of time, so they do these studies with often very small children. So they took 8 students in this study, ranging from 7 up to 17. So this was one of the first studies done with adolescents. And they put these children through a very intensive intervention for about 8 weeks, 2 hours a day. So this is what we would call a clinical study. This was not a school-based study. And they tested the children. This is one of the first studies that tested the children 2 different ways, pre and post. They gave them all reading tests at the beginning and scanned their brains. And then 8 weeks later, gave them a reading test and scanned their brains for the second time and found that the deficit in functional brain organization that was underlying their dyslexia can be reversed with sufficiently intense intervention lasting as little as 2 months. This was such exciting news. Now, the pre and post reading test showed that, yes, their reading got better in just a matter of a few weeks, 80 hours of instruction. Their reading got better, but their functional brain organization changed. And one of the fascinating things of the study is the pictures that they show of the students, of what their brains were doing before the intervention and after the intervention. And in every case, to different levels of change, because we do also understand, as you'll read in the book, that dyslexia is a spectrum disorder, meaning that some of our children have very mild dyslexia and some have moderate to very severe dyslexia. So interventions affect children differently. But in every case, with this 15-year-old and the 10-year-old, before the intervention, they were processing their linguistic information on the right hemisphere, and after the intervention, it changed function of their brain, and they were processing it in the left hemisphere. So here are some big ideas that we know about dyslexia now, today in 2021. We know it is not a visual spatial issue. And we've known for a long time that it can't really be a visual issue because blind children learn to read with relative ease. Reading doesn't require the eyes at all, and blind children can have dyslexia. But when we look at our children who are deaf or hearing impaired, almost all of them have difficulty, up to tremendous difficulty, learning to read. We understand that reading, that dyslexia is primarily an auditory issue that does vary in impact. This is that notion of a spectrum disorder. It's genetic, as we talked about in those slides before. We also understand, and Fletcher et al. Are very clear about this, that you can have no trace of genetic challenges in your family. There are certainly people, and we need to acknowledge that children will show up and clearly have dyslexia, and it doesn't seem to be present in their parents or grandparents. So that can happen, but it does seem to be a genetic consideration throughout family. And but as Fletcher et al. And others who specifically study the genetics of dyslexia, it's not a gene. It is clusters of genes that researchers are still figuring out how to track that. Dyslexia can, not always, but can affect speaking fluency, because all of this is the left hemisphere activities. Processing language, storing language, accessing language can affect reading, writing, and spelling, but also speaking. We're going to spend some time tonight, and in the book, we certainly spend time talking about the emotional consequences and the effect on confidence and so many other issues. Perhaps 15% of the population, we talk about that on page 19. The question mark is because researchers are still not in all complete agreement about this, ranging from a low of 1% to a high of 20%, but there's general agreement around perhaps 10 to 15%. So, so grateful that when I was writing this book, I had access to and permission from the lovely, wonderful Nancy Young, who created this graphic, where she is presenting very solid research information in such an easy to interpret form. And this, we'll present this in pages later in the book, pages 120 and 121, to talk about teaching reading. But I thought I would use this tonight just to talk about the 10 to 15%, which is the number right now based on the research I'm familiar with that I'm comfortable with children who have dyslexia. The rest of this ladder is really showing the general percentages of children who find learning to read extremely easy, those precocious readers at the top, about 5%. 35% of children learn to read relatively easy. The majority of children need some kind of systematic code-based instruction to learn to read, and then our children with dyslexia. And this is really what that instruction looks like, is the focus of the last two chapters in the book. So I'm going to stop there and see if there have been any questions that have come in, and I'll let Amy pass those on to me. I'll take a sip of water here and see how things are going so far.
Thank you, Jan. We do have a couple of questions.
Wonderful.
The first question up is from Doreen, and her question is, who can diagnose dyslexia and who typically makes this diagnosis?
Doreen, that is an excellent question, and we essentially devoted an entire chapter to that. It will be chapter 3, so that's our next session. And if you're eager, if you haven't gotten to chapter 3 yet, that's where you're going to find your answer. However, it is not a cut and dried answer. That's one of the places where experts will give you different answers. And the answers about who can diagnose dyslexia will vary depending if you're in the United States. It will depend on what state you live in. If you live in Canada, the answer will be different. We have at least one person here tonight from Malaysia, possibly other countries. So those are almost legal issues about who has the right to do that. I think what you're going to find as you read this book that I come down on the idea, and we'll certainly spend some time talking about that when we talk about chapter 3, is that we don't have a blood test. We don't have fMRI access for most of us. We don't have definitive ways of saying a child absolutely has dyslexia or they don't. What the researchers that I am most inclined to believe are saying that it is we know what the signs are, and we're going to start talking about that here in this chapter. We know what some of those early signs are that we can be looking for, and we know that we can look for those patterns. And if those patterns are present, enough of them are present, they're strong enough, we as parents, we as educators, should be able to say, it is very likely that this child has dyslexia. The law comes in when we have to, when the access to actual school-based services are only granted for children who are formally assessed and labeled, if you will, as having dyslexia in some states or a specific learning disability in other states. So the answers vary, but in general, we look for the signs and characteristics of dyslexia. And the reason I'm comfortable being a little bit wishy-washy on that is because what you're also going to find out in chapters 4 and 5 is that the label doesn't matter as much as the skill weaknesses. That's what we address rather than treating a child with dyslexia radically differently than we treat a different child. So good, important, complex question you've answered there, and we'll continue to explore that over our 3 sessions together. Anything else, Amy?
Yes, we actually have a bunch of questions. Okay. So I'm wondering, Jan, if you want to finish your presentation, and then if we have time, or
excellent.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say I am capturing the questions, so even if it seems like right now, wait, she didn't answer my question. All right. I do have those.
Thank you. And that is also what our follow-up sessions, those 2 sessions, sort of designated for educators and designated for parents, are going to be an opportunity for that too. So we do want to answer all your questions. In chapter 2, we talk on page 37 about early intervention, and you will hear that over and over and over in the book. Early intervention. It's the most important thing because it's where we get the best news about dyslexia. And the research is so clear. This is some of the research being done by Dr. Nadine Gaab, who is working with children well before they learn to read, including infants. And the good, wonderful news is we can identify these language-based concerns really early. And if we do that and provide early and appropriate intervention, this is where we get people using the terms like Dr. Shaywitz talking about overcoming dyslexia, or Fletcher and colleagues, or Dr. Gaab talking about preventing dyslexia. They're not saying that we're changing the brain so much that it's just a normal brain. What we're saying is we can help with early identification and early appropriate intervention. We can help that brain become functioning to the point where we have prevented the difficulties that come, the challenges that come with dyslexia. I am active on Twitter, as some of you know, and have stayed active there because I stay connected only. I have nothing to do with any politicians or rock stars or any of those people. I simply follow people who are involved with reading, including Dr. Gab. And in October, she tweeted one day that we should keep in mind that all children who struggle with learning to read need evidence-based interventions regardless of the cause of the struggle, regardless of their schools or parents' resources, their skin color, or whether or not they have a dyslexia diagnosis or not. And that goes back to that original question. Our task is to make that happen. All children who struggle, regardless of their cause, deserve intervention, and that intervention, when done correctly, is often very similar across those disorders. So on page 19 of the book, I reiterate that idea by saying the question is, how can we help anyone who struggles with reading, writing, and spelling, regardless of the presumed cause? This is where we are in 2021 in terms of intervention. We have such powerful assessment tools available to us in schools, not the brain fMRIs, but assessment tools that a classroom teacher can use. And most importantly, the powerful interventions that we can get started early, help that brain reorganize itself and get started with conquering dyslexia as early as possible. A couple of pages in the book in chapter 2 devoted to our English learners who have the additional challenge of having dyslexia. Essentially, just to share with you the basic findings from quite a bit of research with our EL students with dyslexia, is that the same assessments, the same interventions work with those children. And we need to be certainly cognizant of the fact that the challenges will often be greater with that language component too. I wished that I had had this resource available to me. Any of you, all of you who work with English learners, whether or not they have dyslexia, you want to get this book. By my friend and colleague, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. Unfortunately, it came out in 2020 after I had finished reading the book, but it is a wonderful resource with terrific ideas that certainly go much deeper than I did in my book. The emotional, behavioral, and social impacts. 6 pages of this little book devoted to that, because we know anybody who's a parent, teachers, tutors, we know so much. We just need to talk about the reality of these impacts of dyslexia. On one of the things on page 48, actually, in the book, I hope you do take the time to read a page from Noah's journal that he wrote every single day in his English language arts class. At the time that he wrote this, he was 18 years old. He was a high school senior who was reading at about the 4th grade level, spelling maybe at the 3rd grade level on a good day. And every day in his English class, he had to write in his journal. And I was given permission to share that in the book, and you can see it. It's challenging to read because of his spelling and his handwriting. It's challenging to read because of the emotional outpouring that he's talking about, essentially feeling tortured in his class. And he ends this page of writing by saying, "School just hurts me." And it hurts me every time I read this letter, knowing how many children are struggling with this. This was given to a colleague of mine. Many of you probably know Dr. Nancy Mather is a good friend of mine and literally world famous in the field of dyslexia. And at one of the times when she was speaking about dyslexia, a parent came up to her and handed her a piece of paper, and it was Noah's mother who gave her this paper, just in absolute desperation. What's going on with my son? Certainly this can't be right. Whew. So the response to this, Our Children Who Suffer, has been fabulous, important, world-changing activism from many parents. And I wanted to spend time, and I'm definitely grateful that I did in the book, but it continues to this day. So literally last Sunday, today is Tuesday, so on Sunday, January 10th, there was a blog that was brought to my attention. It was written on Sunday. I have since subscribed to this blog, written by a woman who is both a teacher and a parent of a child with dyslexia. And the blog she wrote on Sunday was called Healing Depression Through the Science of Reading. It is powerful. It is wonderful. I highly suggest you read it. So this parent activism continues to this day. And this is one of the things that she wrote in that blog. We, parents of children with dyslexia, witness the effects of poor teaching instruction every day. There is a reason we are so passionate, so angry, so committed. Our children are in pain. They are haunted. Some have given up. And all of you who work with these children, and especially if you are the parent of a child, you know how true this is and how agonizing it is. So we shared some stories in the book. I shared Lizzie's story, and Laura Cooper shared the story of her son, Sam, on pages 8 and 9. If you've read it, you know his story, but Sam's story is so true for so many of us. It's almost universal. You will recognize this, that he was a joyful baby, toddler, and preschool. But as soon as he started going to kindergarten, he just didn't want to do it anymore. Those avoidance behaviors started early, full on temper tantrums every night. Laura wrote, my joyful little boy was now joyless. He hated school. He had stomach aches every day. But Sam was one of those quiet, well-mannered children, so he flew under the radar of many of his teachers. But Sam was one of those lucky kids, as Lizzie was. She and I still to this day talk about teacher angels, and Lizzie's teacher angel came at 4th grade. Sam was lucky enough to have a 2nd grade teacher who not only understood dyslexia, but knew what to do about it. And it just so happens that 2nd grade teacher is one of our co-hosts tonight, Julie Bedell, who also, told her story in the book of her tutoring work. And so several different vignettes about her work. And also just to tell you that Julie today is still a 2nd grade teacher. She taught 2nd grade today and has already tutored after school one child with dyslexia. And as soon as we're done tonight, she's going to be tutoring someone else. So talk about those teacher angels, but there just aren't enough of them to do this. So we need our parent activism to continue. We do understand and wrote in the book about dyslexia being a family disorder for sure. And that has been the impetus of the amazing Decoding Dyslexia groups, 2 of whom, one from Wisconsin, one from Pennsylvania, which is co-sponsoring this book study. There are Decoding Dyslexia groups in every state. If you are a parent of a child with dyslexia, you need to definitely get connected with the Decoding Dyslexia group in your state. I also included resources, the best resources, the websites, the trainings, the ways that we can support both educators and parents. And that's included in the back of the book, as well as quite an extensive glossary. And that was included in the book, actually, thanks to my friend and colleague, Anita Archer, who generously took the time to read the book and wrote a very nice supportive review of the book. But as she read it, she said, this is clearly going to be very useful for parents, Jan, but you need to have a glossary there to make sure that the terms you're using are defined for everybody reading the book, but often these might be new words for parents. So much more that I could talk about, and we do have some time here tonight, so I will be able to take some more questions. But following up to what Julie said, I hope, if you can, that you will join the facilitated discussion groups that will happen after each of these presentations. So the ones focused on chapters 1 and 2, sponsored by my friends and colleagues at Reed Washington, will happen next Tuesday and Thursday night. And again, as Julie said, you can join either one, both if you want to. It's not exclusive, but we thought we would try to keep the conversations more focused on parents' needs and educators' needs at those discussions. So next up for me, the presentation will be for chapter 3, when we talk about the assessments around dyslexia. That will be Tuesday, January 26th. So you can go back to that Google Doc for the link for that one, same time, same place. So I want to thank you all so much for your participation tonight. We are recording this and you can see it again if you wish, but I'm going to turn it over now to Amy again and invite her back to share any questions, or at least a few minutes of questions that you might have shared tonight.
Yeah, so we've got quite a few. So I think
Okay.
Just to make it easy and out of fairness to all the questions that came in, I'll just start from the beginning with them and we can just go through them until we run out of time tonight.
Okay.
So the first question was, from Meg, what is Jan's opinion on the early screening laws being implemented in many states, including Washington State?
Jan's opinion, I love those questions. Those are my favorite questions. I can just tell you what I think, whether or not they're research-based. But my opinion around assessments are very strongly rooted in research. I can't speak, Meg, to all of the different laws. I'm grateful because many of those laws are being driven by parent activists who are absolutely 110% correct that the way their children's needs are going to get addressed is if we find them to begin with as early as possible, screen students so that we can determine which of the kids who are very likely going to go on and do fine with reading, as we talk about the reading ladder, that they're somewhere at the top portions of those ladders, and which students through those screenings need and deserve a little bit of a deeper look. And a lot of those screening assessments we can use with great fidelity, what researchers would call reliability. We can trust the results, and validity. They tell us real stuff. Even with really young children. And that's the case that Nadine Gabb is making, that Jack Fletcher and colleagues, that Sharon Vaughn, everybody I know is saying that we need to do those screenings and get it right. The challenge is once the legislators get involved and people who may not fully understand the research, and I certainly can't say that I've read all those laws because I haven't. And I know a lot of them are copying from state to state. I have some concerns from some of those laws that I've seen that they're not being guided by the best research, that rather than doing quick screenings, we're doing a deeper dive with all children. And I'm concerned about that really only because of time. My opinion again, but I also think the research supports at the first stage of assessment, which we consider screening, it should be relatively quick. And we do have solidly reliable and valid assessments that are quick, that can let children get back to instruction rather than an hour or more of assessment that is really not necessary. And doing that for every child, I have concerns about that. But the concept of screening children as early as possible for dyslexia, I could not be more happy about that.
Excellent. We have time for another question here.
Yeah.
Doreen's question, what types of activities did they do in the intervention that you're just describing? I think it's when you were talking about the fMRI results.
Right,
Yes.
the CMOSs. That was a very intensive phonological and phonemic awareness intervention. That's what they really focused on. They did some work with phonics, but it was really retraining the brain. And we talk about those activities a little bit in chapter 2, but more in chapters 4 and 5, particularly chapter 5. Phonemic and phonological awareness activities, where we can start those kinds of things with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and start literally rewiring the brain to process those sounds. That is the foundational ability of the brain that allows us then to teach phonics, how to decode words, and ultimately how to start creating sight words where we can instantly, all of that rests on, and 20 years later, we know so much more about that, but that's what they did 20 years ago, was a very intense 2 hours a day for those children, focusing on sounds and components of words and just auditory, just training those auditory pathways in the brain. So that's what that was. Good question.
Okay, another question. This is someone wondering about the dyslexia spectrum. Are there different terms or labels for different places on that continuum?
Generally not, aside from mild, moderate, severe are the labels that are typically used by dyslexia researchers as well as tutors and practitioners. And those are, again, not, we don't have scales or blood tests or other mechanisms to precisely measure when you move from mild to moderate, or it's more of the severity of the symptoms, how compared to neurotypical children of your age, how much lower are you in all the component skills, such as phonemic and phonological awareness, that ability to perceive the sounds of language. Is that mild? Is your difficulty mild? Is it moderate? Is it severe? And often you'll have some children with some aspects that phonological awareness may be severe, but other components might be more mild or moderate. So it's one of the least precise ways or components of what we do around that language. It's really at the tail ends of that. The very severe dyslexic or the very mild dyslexic are more easy to be confident about. I say that my daughter was mild to moderate. That's perfectly acceptable to talk about that. We have children who are moderate to severe. Yeah, so it's not very precise.
Okay, we still have a little bit of time for another
Yeah,
question.
sure.
Excellent. William asked, which tests do you feel are adequate for diagnosing or ruling out dyslexia? Are they done in conjunction? Yeah,
go ahead, please.
Nope. Go just, are they done in conjunction with a psychoeducational eval or as a standalone?
Okay. And William, I will obviously spend more time focused on that in our next session, chapter 3, because the whole chapter is devoted to that, the assessments. We have a variety of assessments and there is disagreement. I'll just tantalize you with that is whether we should do those skills-based assessments in conjunction with and alongside the psychoeducational. There is strong debate about that, and we will devote some time to that. But just know that you're going to talk to experts who say, absolutely, you need to do the skills assessments and the psychoeducational, and there are people who say, really, it's just the skills assessments that you need. So we'll do a little bit deeper dive. There's no definitive answer to that. Very good question.
Okay, and let's see here. When we have a struggling reader whose family has shared that they have a family member with dyslexia, what degree of a red flag should that be when we are working with that reader?
It's just, and we'll talk about that next week as well, because that is all part of that the traits that we look at to say, yes, you have dyslexia, or no, that you don't. It's a contributing factor, but the researchers that I pay attention to, as well as the practitioners, would say that we would never not serve a child because there's no evidence of dyslexia in their family. And we have children with genetic evidence of dyslexia in their family who, because of circumstances, early identification, early powerful intervention, that never manifest the characteristics of dyslexia. So we pay attention to the contributions of possible genetic contributions through parent surveys and those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it's only one piece, and it's, to me, it's one of the smaller pieces of evidence that we pay attention to because of that fact that there are children who we just don't have evidence of genetic contributions who clearly have dyslexia, and children who clearly have the genetic contributions who don't have any of the manifestations. So it's a piece, we should consider it, but it's a minor piece in the overall contribution or consideration.
Okay, let's see here. Curiosity, this is out of curiosity, I think.
Okay.
My wife is dyslexic, hence my daughter is 2. I am a prolific reader with hearing issues. My wife is bilingual.
Wow.
So right. So I'm curious on how the auditory affects the reading.
Ah, yes. And it's fascinating. I'm so glad you asked that question, and you've got a lot going on in your family for sure, because what we know about reading, what for decades and decades we understood or believed thought reading was a visual issue. It just kind of makes sense because almost all of us read with our eyes. And so when kids, in fact, the very first term in print that was ever used to describe dyslexia was called word blindness. The physician who had a patient who was brilliant and prolific and talented in many things, but could not read or spell, that physician wrote about this patient and called it, diagnosis was word blindness. So we believed it was the eyes. We now know, because we can get inside the brain and look at it, that reading, writing, and spelling are all based on functional language processing, especially the auditory aspect. I'll do a much deeper dive on in that when we get to chapters 4 and 5. But if you're bilingual and dyslexic, there's many challenges going on, and but good, again, there's always good news here when we're talking about dyslexia. Good intervention as early as possible can help with all of that.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And I just want to say again, if you're still here, we did capture all your questions either through the chat that you put in the chat or in the question and answer feature. So we'll figure out a way how to incorporate those at some point.
Very good.
This last question, is there any benefit to screening families of kindergartners to see if they have dyslexia in their family so that we can watch those students?
I would say probably most people would consider doing that through a voluntary response to something like a questionnaire. So I wouldn't screen parents at a school, but as part of the screening that is being mandated in many states, there often is a voluntary, has to be voluntary, because this is essentially medical information that people can choose to share or not share, to say, we believe we have dyslexia in the family or not. So I think it's a consideration, but again, it's one of the most minor pieces that we should consider. Never not serving a child because we don't have that evidence.
Okay, I will save the rest of the questions since it's 1 minute before 6.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you again, everybody. We hope to see you at the guided chats and next the 26th when we talk about chapter 3 of the book. Thank you all so much. Good night. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.